Hello, this is Alan MacLeod from Mint Press News here. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I guess I should just introduce myself. Yes, I'm senior staff writer at Mint Press News, which is an independent media channel that really looks to critique US empire. And that's what I do in my day-to-day job. And particularly of interest to me is the media. I did a PhD about how the media cover Venezuela. And what I found in general was that there was an overwhelming bias in favor of pro-US sources and anti-government sources in the Western media coverage of Venezuela, painting it with an extremely negative brush and really portraying it as a dictatorship rather than a democracy. As part of my PhD, probably the most important part was me actually interviewing the Western journalists who create the coverage that we all see in the West. And what I found was really extraordinary. These journalists were very open with me, and they were completely willing to share a lot of facts that perhaps they might not want published or publicized to a broader world. What I found was that journalists in Venezuela who work for big outlets like the New York Times or the Financial Times or whoever really see themselves as the ideological tip of the spear in a movement trying to unseat the Bolivarian Revolution. They literally, in their newsrooms, call themselves, quote, the resistance, end quote, to Chavez and now Maduro. One person I interviewed, who is now a New York Times correspondent, told me that he really sees himself as, quote, a mercenary, end quote, for hire, and that he really saw his role as just providing a service to whoever really paid for it. He also told me that he deliberately implants false or grossly exaggerated stories into Western media in order to fit an agenda, and that agenda was to demonize the government. One example of this was a story about how condoms apparently cost $750 in Venezuela, which he freely admitted was not the case, but he regardless got that story into his outlet, and then that went viral all around the world, despite it being completely false. So that's the sort of level of that's the sort of level of just cynicism among the journalistic community who cover Venezuela. There are journalists, dissident journalists, I call them, that did work in media outlets there that saw things a little differently, who were perhaps more sympathetic to the government there, but they quickly learned that they couldn't really survive in that context. They knew what their editors wanted, and they couldn't really develop a career without towing the line. So one journalist I talked to who worked for the Financial Times told me openly that he started to self-censor and stopped pitching stories that he knew just would not get accepted by his publication. He later wrote a book about it called The Racket. His name's Matt Kennard, and it's a really good book actually. And yeah, he told me that he was just completely disillusioned with the whole system, and that many of his colleagues were really anti-government activists first and journalists second. Other journalists out there told me that they felt very uncomfortable in that situation, working alongside a lot of Venezuelan journalists who worked for big media outlets like El Nacional and El Universal, who were key ringleaders in the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez. So these are the sorts of people who are actually making the content that Westerners and people from outside of Venezuela read, see, and hear on a daily basis. And it was very interesting to see that kind of practice, that theoretical practice, actually play out in July. I was there for about 2 weeks in Venezuela, monitoring the elections. And what we saw from the media was very similar to what we've seen in previous elections, where they ramp up the campaign of fear against the government. They start talking about the opposition are bound to win, citing highly dubious polls that are very likely funded by the US government in one way or another, in order to create the illusion that there is this gigantic majority in Venezuela who want to see the government toppled. Media also put in a whole ton of factoids that are true in a vacuum, but are grossly misleading and push readers to view the situation in one way or another. An example of this in the recent election was the fact that Nicholas Maduro's image appears 13 times on the ballot. Now, while that is true, the media used that factoid to grossly distort the coverage, claiming that this was evidence of Maduro being a dictator. But when you actually look at the voting slip, it suddenly becomes very clear why Maduro's face is on there 13 times. It's because he was endorsed by 13 major parties. And Venezuelan democracy is not like in the US where there are two parties and that's it. There are dozens of political parties in Venezuela, and all of them chose one or another candidate to be their presidential nomination. And Maduro was chosen by 13 um, people. Other opposition figures were on the ballot multiple times. Luis Martinez, for example, was on there 6 times. Edmundo Gonzalez, the main opposition candidate who won 40-something% of the vote, his face was on there multiple times as well. So if you gave that sort of context, or even just showed readers the ballot, which is very easy to do, I mean, you can look at it online, that sort of narrative starts to break down. Another example of this was the fact that Maria Corina Machado was barred from running. That was cited constantly in media reports as proof of dictatorship and an election that didn't make any sense and was completely unjustified, and nobody should be supporting it. But again, nobody in Western media actually told their readers why Maria Corina Machado was being barred from running. The fact that she flew around the world, even became, a representative of Panama, tried to organize foreign invasions of the country, including from the United States and from Israel, and also tried to conduct a campaign of sanctions against the country. Now, in any other sort of country, you would expect her to either be executed or put in prison for life. But instead, her punishment for doing all of this was just that she couldn't stand for election formally. Although, of course, we do know, and everyone I spoke to in Venezuela knew that a vote for Gonzalez was actually a vote for Machado. And that includes opposition supporters who I talked to across Caracas on July 28th, and indeed earlier as well. And they all told me, listen, when I said, are you going to vote for Maduro or Edmundo or someone else? They would say, I'm voting for Maria, meaning that they understood that Maria was the real force behind Edmundo Gonzalez's campaign. As I said, on election day, I visited 5 polling stations across the Caracas area. And what I found basically was a situation of complete normalcy. I went to voting booths in both opposition and Chavista strongholds and talked to the officials there. And overwhelmingly, what they told me was that the situation was completely normal. The two words they used most were tranquilo, which is like calm or tranquil, or fluido, meaning smooth or fluid. And that was the way that the election managers in those places talked about what was going on. I was on my own at some time and also alongside many, many foreign observers. There were more than 900 international observers, including from the United Nations and from more than 100 countries around the world. And we were allowed in. Nobody seemed at all surprised that we were there. The reaction to our presence ranged from complete indifference to friendliness from officials there. We spoke to many, many officials, many of whom, and in fact, some of whom actually openly told me that they were members of the opposition, that they hated the government, that they thought Maduro was all wrong, and that they were only doing this job because they needed the money. And when I asked her, well, what do you think of the election process itself? She, who was actually in charge of one election center in the center of Caracas, she said, actually, I have complete trust in the system itself. She just didn't trust political parties. So that was really the sense that I got, which was one that of an election happening in complete normalcy. Apart from, of course, we should say the terrible sanctions and the threats coming from the United States. Really, the only major problem I saw with the election process was that in the morning, both the opposition and the governments told their supporters to come out early and vote early in the morning. And that led to a lot of long lines happening whereby people had to wait sometimes for hours to vote. Interestingly, though, the voting center that I visited with the longest lines was actually in a strongly pro-government area. And so that suggests that perhaps, it was fair across the board. I would say also that the very high turnout meant that, yes, in the morning there were long lines, but actually by the afternoon the situation had dissipated and that people didn't have to wait too long. I was allowed to film pretty much whatever I wanted in the voting centers, and then at night we waited for the results to come through. And what we saw was that Nicholas Maduro won with more than 50% of the vote, actually gaining more votes than all other parties combined. And let's remember that it wasn't just two people standing for election, there were actually 10 people running for president. At which point the opposition called on their supporters to vent their anger in the streets. And that has led to a long, long situation that we are still finding ourselves in, where the opposition, rather predictably, I would say, has not accepted the results and is looking for international allies. And that has included the United States, who has refused to recognize Maduro's victory and now seems clearly to be trying to hatch some sort of plan to support the opposition from abroad. This might end up in a sort of Juan Guaido 2.0 situation. We'll have to see how that comes along. There's been a lot of talk about the actas, these paper slips that should be published, and I hope that does happen. But very few people have mentioned that there were actually clearly coordinated attacks on the CNE, the National Electoral Council, which has slowed down that process. So I guess we just await those results to be coming through. So yeah, I mean, I guess what I saw in Venezuela was a divided country, but one where there was a clear and unmistakable popular enthusiasm for the government. I went to one rally in Caracas on the Thursday before the election, which must have had at least 1.5 million people there. Some estimates put it up as high as 2 million. And just the extraordinary energy of the thing was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And it really underscored the complete and utter lies and hypocrisy of Western media who claim that there is no popular support for Maduro in Venezuela. It was absolutely obvious for everybody to see that a large percentage of the public does support Maduro and does continue to support the revolution. Not that you'd ever hear that in Western media. And that's really not an accident. Venezuela has been portrayed as a dictatorship for more than 2 decades, and really ever since Hugo Chavez led the Bolivarian Revolution. Why is that? It's because this revolution poses a threat to the dominance of the United States. Not a threat to the people, not a threat to the sovereignty of the United States, but a threat to the overwhelming hegemony of US rule around the world and of neoliberal capitalism. Because the government, first led by Chavez and now by Maduro, are trying to offer an alternative model that people around the world can look to and learn from. And that is really the most dangerous thing for the United States. They fear alternatives being brought up and talked about, because if things can be done in Venezuela to improve people's lives, it means that countries like the United States or in Western Europe, countries that are far richer and have far more resources than Venezuela, another world is eminently possible. And that's really what people in Washington are scared that people around the world will realize. And so I guess my final thought is that the coverage of Venezuela in the media is not an accident. It's not a mistake by journalists who just don't understand the situation. They actually understand the situation and their role completely, just completely. It is an extremely conscious decision to present a democracy as a dictatorship in order to demonize alternatives to the status quo, because ultimately that is what corporate media is there for. It is there to to push narratives and push agendas and get people to think whatever the owners and the advertisers of those media outlets want them to think. Journalism has always been used as a weapon, and it's being used as a weapon right now against Venezuela. So the last thing I'll say is, remember, before they send in the troops, they always send in the journalists. Anyway, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.